it's been such a failure of these kind of reductionistic approaches to chronic fatigue, especially things like germ theory. So as soon as I say chronic fatigue syndrome, ME, and those related illnesses, everyone starts to think, oh, it's, you know, it's a virus that causes it, or it's a bug. We're going to just talk about that briefly at the beginning and kind of explode that theory about why it's never taken hold in the mainstream or alternative side truly either. Well, I'm going to talk about something called the clinical trinity, which is this idea about how we approach a complex illness like CFS holistically. So coming from both a biochemical, an energetic, and a psychological viewpoint, because that's what we need with these kind of illnesses to be truly to have the best outcomes for our patients. And then I want to get into a kind of at the biochemical functional level. I want to talk about limbic kindling and the cell danger response so that everybody knows what are some of the latest discussions going on in the cutting edge research in CFS that work along the lines we're interested in. So they're holistic, systems based, functional medicine based. And then we'll tie in these other levels by talking about what are the biochemical, energetic, and psychological environmental factors to address. So we can't cover everything in this 1 hour, so we're just going to cover some of the environmental factors today, sort of going through this model. So, and Q&A at the end, so please do, very happy to answer questions. So let's talk about what I meant by this persistent failure of germ theory of CFS-ME. So if you do a literature review of chronic fatigue syndrome ME, and this is the same with multiple chemical sensitivity, fibromyalgia, a lot of autoimmune diseases as well, you see a lot of viruses and bacteria associated with the illness. And the common ones with chronic fatigue is as you may know, are things like Epstein-Barr virus, human herpes virus 6, enteroviruses, those are viruses of the gut, cytomegaloviruses, paravirus B19 has been linked, and even very serious retroviruses like XMRV. The kind of bacteria and so on that have been linked to things like mycoplasma, chlamydia, chronic Borrelia, which is obviously the Lyme bug, Brucella, Rickettsia, Babesia that you often see in Lyme disease as well. So now this is a book that is by Dr. Kenny Demernier, who is really the top research doctor in Europe for chronic fatigue, and here's his book that he wrote, one of his latest books, Chronic Fatigue Syndrome, A Biological Approach. And he really sums up, when he talks about viruses in relation to chronic fatigue, he says, the results of the studies are not consistent. Many of these viruses, like Epstein-Barr, are endemic within human beings, with infections occurring early in life. Therefore, a new primary infection by these viruses is unlikely. Most evidence points to a reactivation of these endemic viruses rather than primary infection. So you can't say chronic fatigue is caused by Epstein-Barr because the studies have shown loads of people have Epstein-Barr and don't have chronic fatigue. So this is what they mean by it not being a primary infection, but something is causing an infection which is in many, many people. In some people it expresses, and other people it doesn't express. Here's what else he said about the bacteria. Demernier also points out that most of the other co-infections that may be found in ME/CFS patients are probably opportunistic and are there as a result of changes in the immune system which are first being brought about by other factors, many of them non-infectious. So what would be the sort of things that would weaken a system such that a virus or a virus would express, and then you get co-infections like the bacteria move in, because the host has been weakened. And what does Demernier list based on his literature review? His book is full of research, by the way, research papers. Toxic heavy metals, organophosphates, pregnancy can trigger chronic fatigue, chronic emotional, physical stress, and then things like cellular stress from factors like blood transfusions, and obviously infections such as viruses. Those things all enable bacteria that the person maybe, we're all exposed to bacteria all the time. It only takes hold in some people and not others. So these things are opportunistic, often show up because the body's already weakened. So I have to mention XMRV. This was a infectious retrovirus. It's a serious thing. It's similar. The HIV virus is also a retrovirus, which means that it doesn't just go into the body, do damage, and then leave, and then the body recovers. It means it can do permanent damage to the immune system. So this was a very serious finding, and some very major researchers started to say, well, we think XMRV as a cause of chronic fatigue. And this was in Science in 2009. So one of the top 2 leading medical science journals in the world. It was in Science in 2009. Now, this was unheard of in the world of chronic fatigue syndrome and ME, which is a vastly underfunded and under-investigated area in medical science. So to have any study with chronic fatigue in science was a massive impact on the whole community. And of course, it just never stuck. And there's some conspiracy theories about maybe it was a cover-up, who knows. But the sad news is that paper was retracted. You can see I've highlighted it there, Science in 2011. So it was a huge controversy. But, you know, and I said at the time, even if it was found, and this made the people who founded the HIV virus, who discovered the HIV virus, Luc Montagnier, Dr. Luc Montagnier won the Nobel Prize for discovering the HIV virus. Even he said that you can help reduce HIV and help even recover from it through diet. So, you know, it's the same thing. Why does it take hold? Why do viruses take hold of some people really badly and not others? So the point is, we don't want to get over-focused on viruses and bacteria, and we don't want to go in there like focusing on just killing the bacteria and the virus. What we want to look at is the terrain of the body. Why has the body enabled these bacteria and viruses to take hold, and treat the terrain, not the bacteria and the virus? Now, we can treat them, but it kind of, many practitioners who work in chronic fatigue, it's lower priority. It's not the first thing we'd do. We'd strengthen the body first and let the body deal with the virus when the terrain was sorted out. In chronic fatigue syndrome ME, there's Court Johnson. He's probably the best blogger about chronic fatigue on the internet. His website is healthrising.org, and he just summed up that whole XMRV debacle where he said, "Science giveth and science taketh away," because for a while we were headline news and then it's all gone away again. So, but you know, it's never. I don't think we're ever going to find a single bug or virus, and it persists. This is the germ theory of disease that was great when we had things like polio and we had, you know, all the infectious diseases of 100, 200 years ago. Today's illnesses are chronic complex illnesses where it's not just one single factor, and it may not even be the most important. It might be the least important because the bugs and the bacteria are downstream from other factors that we need to address first. So that's the first thing to say, and it's why if you've heard about bugs and bacteria and viruses causing chronic fatigue and why I'm not immediately talking about it, that's why. So here's this idea. It's just been talked about for a long time in Europe. It's called the milieu intérieur, the biological terrain. And supposedly, on his deathbed, the founder of germ theory, Louis Pasteur, said, "Le microbe n'est rien et le terrain est tout." The microbe is nothing and the terrain is everything. You know, if you have a rubbishy terrain that's sort of toxic with pesticides and toxic thoughts and chronic emotional stress and EMF stress and all of that, your terrain is weak, and hey, that attracts the bugs. Just like if you have a city that's full of rubbish, the rats come in and they bring disease. So that was the kind of idea, and this is it was Antoine Beauchamp who actually said the terrain's more important than the bug, but Louis Pasteur won the argument at the time, 100 or 200 years ago. So this is a key word, resilience. This is what we want to build in our patients and rebuild. This is a preventative form of care. So we're resilient to these bugs and these viruses and these onslaughts in our environment. What are the factors? This was a slide from my previous part 1 webinar. What are the factors that are influencing the milieu intérieur? All the things which would cause an anti-inflammatory or a pro-inflammatory impact. They affect the body epigenetically, meaning the gene expression turns into a pro-inflammatory or an anti-inflammatory response, depending on all these kinds of factors: exercise, financial stress, you taking injection drugs, exposures to toxic chemicals, your circadian rhythms, and electromagnetic sort of stresses that you may be exposed to, your psychological state and social interactions, and obviously drugs, alternative medicine, the state of your gut bacteria, and obviously diet. And that was a pretty comprehensive list from a kind of mainstream journal, which is great, which is why I have this diagram here. The way that I split these things down is these are the factors. You know, if you consider that I'm calling the clinical trinity. In the last webinar, I kind of had 5 levels, and I called it 5 levels of healing, and that's actually come from some of the work of Dr. Dietrich Klinghardt, who actually based it on, you know, thousands of years of history and Patanjali's 5 bodies. To make this more simple, consider that you and your patients have 3 bodies. You have a physical body, you have an energetic body, and you have a psycho-spiritual body. And factors at all of those levels can be reducing the resilience of your patient. Factors that need to be addressed at the level that they are originating with the tools that are appropriate for that level. So things going on psycho-spiritually and energetically can get moved downwards and affect the physical. It can affect how genes are expressed and how metabolism is occurring, and also vice versa. So things that are happening at the physical level actually impact energetics and also impacts psychology. So we know the gut dysbiosis is now a cause of anxiety and depression, those conditions, those psychiatric conditions. So it's a bi-directional relationship, and the thing I really want to get have people take away from this is the body and the mind are one thing, and it's like the whole body is a kind of hologram where what's happening in the brain will be happening at the cellular level, which will be happening in the whole body, and everything affects everything. So you could have a healing impulse coming from the physical side, which could move up and correct the entire system, or vice versa. Usually most people probably need some interventions at all levels, and why wouldn't you optimize all 3 bodies? So this is the kind of thing I say to patients. Actually, you know, you have 3 bodies to consider, not just one. The sort of things. This is the 3 bodies broken down. So, for example, the physical body, the sort of science which governs this physical body is the biochemistry and structural mechanics. What can go wrong at this level and the features. So that obviously the physical body, it's the structure, it's organs, it's systems, it's like the immune system, cells. Things that can go wrong are things like mitochondrial dysfunction, redox imbalance, adrenal, thyroid problems, endocrine imbalances. Things that contribute to a loss of resilience might be certain predisposing factors like single nucleotide polymorphisms, the SNPs like MTHFR and so on. Having pyroluria, nutrient deficiencies, those things weaken the system. Diagnostic methods at this level, lab testing, blood, urine, saliva, hair, the physical exam. And the sort of therapeutic interventions are obviously drugs, herbal and dietary supplements, chiropractic, osteopathy, massage, exercise, structural work. This is also the level of behavior, external behavior of the patient, like exercising or pacing. Pacing, very important for chronic fatigue. So these have their place and are necessary and often usually appropriate for chronic fatigue patients and any patient with a chronic complex illness. Energetic levels, really at this level, this is where the conventional and even your nutritionists and your naturopaths often have less training in this area, but it's hugely important. Gigantic impact on especially chronic fatigue. The energetic level, the science governing this is really physics as opposed to biochemistry. It's physics, quantum physics, and actually maths as well if you're talking about the informational level of energy. So at this level, the features of this, we're talking about meridians, we're talking about energy flow, we're talking about the electromagnetic fields which are around the body, and information fields which are around the organs and the entire body. What can go wrong? Things like energetic blockages, disturbances in fields of the body. Diagnostic methods. A lot of people don't realize that CAT scans and MRI scans, which are used obviously in the conventional medicine, are energetic scans. They are electromagnetic. They're looking at electrical sort of brain function and so on. HRV, heart rate variability, it's electrical. Heart rate, it's electrical. pH is based on physics, not so much biochemistry. Another thing you can do is conductivity, electroacupuncture, EAV testing. At this level, kinesiology and actual energetic information field scanning as well, all kind of diagnostic methods at this level. What are the interventions? Things like acupuncture, microcurrent therapies, acupuncture again, the pulse electromagnetic frequency, that's PEMF devices. What we call infoceuticals, that would also be things like homeopathy, colour and light therapy, breathwork, yoga, tai chi, qigong, all have huge impact on chronic fatigue. Earthing, your circadian rhythms and how well you're connected with the earth and sunlight. Structured water, magnets, heat, cold have massive impacts on the body and pH, as I mentioned there. So there's some really important interventions that if you don't know about at that level, can have a major impact. The psychospiritual level, so important, the psychospiritual level. Psychoneuroimmunology, the study of how what goes on psychologically affects biochemical and by the biology. So what are the sciences that govern this level? Actually, it's philosophy, spirituality, meaning. For some, it's religion. Science has not yet spoken to meaning, so it's not the realm of the science, and yet it has a huge impact on physical well-being. So the features of your conscious and unconscious beliefs at this level, emotional health, the meaning, the purpose, and your values, how it's your subjective world. What can go wrong at this level? Things like adverse childhood experiences, emotional trauma, a maladaptive stress response, maladaptive response to stress in the brain, our personality and Enneagram traits, which can be negative or can work out negatively, intergenerationally inherited trauma, and of course the nocebo, which is opposite of placebo. So nocebo is if you believe you're going to be unwell, then you will be. That's the power of belief. So how do we diagnose at this level? Questionnaires, psychological assessments. Some people use intuition, empathy. You can also do energetic scanning, and there's something called psych kinesiology at this level as well. So you can use kinesiology and apply it to psychology. Interventions, psychotherapy, NLP, CBT, that's cognitive behavioral therapy, EFT, EMDR, that's eye movement desensitization and reprogramming. We've talked about this in a couple of other of my webinars. TFT, somatic experiencing, meditation, obviously, neurofeedback, contemplation. Spiritual practice, and what's the meaning in your life, what's your purpose, what's the meaning you've given about being ill, for example, and also working on things like the Enneagram. So this is what we call the clinical trinity. This is what, and just think right now, how does your modality fit into this? So this can be a very useful understanding about how, you don't have to train and everything, but it's just your awareness that counts. So understanding how your modality fits in with the rest of it. You're either going to build a nice network of referral practitioners, or you might be considering expanding your own practices and finding ways, if you're a biochemical focused practitioner, for example, about how you can bring in some more of the energy recommendations and even diagnoses. Some people, if you're drawn to that particular modality, I usually say to practitioners, if it makes your heart sing when you think about doing this with a patient, that it may be something you want to add. So you don't have to train in everything, though. It's more your awareness about the impact these other sort of bodies and interventions can have. And each body doesn't exist in a vacuum. Humans don't exist in a vacuum. Each body is in an environment that has a tremendous impact on the health of that body. So at the physical level, obviously it's pesticides, chemicals, food, water, personal care, hygiene products, amalgam fillings, metal prosthetics, silicone implants. These are all factors we consider as chronic fatigue syndrome. Exposure to GMO foods, the mineral depletion of the soil. So think about also access to finances and information via the internet, time in nature, urban living. So think about the external physical environment. And the external energetic environment, all the electromagnetic smog we're now faced with, Wi-Fi, mobile phones, smart meters, mobile phone masts, electric off-gassing from all our computers, earth, lack of sunlight, water quality, blue light from screens, so on, things like this. And at the psychospiritual level, very important, this is probably the most important level. I'm going to go through some of the studies, gigantic studies showing that the quality of your relationships with other people have a massive impact on your health. More important than smoking, more important than how much you're exercising, all kinds of factors. So this is where your patient-practitioner relationship, very important. The cultural values and beliefs, which I'll go into later a bit more as well. So you want to be considering that, there's not just internal things you need to do at each body level, but also consider these external factors. So what I want to talk about now is I want to go to the biochemical level for a second, or at least, biochemical level, and look at a functional systems model for chronic fatigue that's being discussed in the latest literature, so that we're going to understand what's going on at the biochemistry, but always having in mind the ultimate causes are coming from any of those three bodies, the originating level of the problem. So starting with limbic kindling, okay. Limbic kindling, as it applies to myalgic encephalomyelitis, that's ME, or chronic fatigue syndrome, was written about by Dr. Leonard Jason. who's the world-leading expert in the case definition of chronic fatigue syndrome. He's a major figure in the chronic fatigue area. He's published many studies. He's been in charge of tens of millions of dollars of research funding that's gone into chronic fatigue. He's the professor of psychology at DePaul University. And it was his team in Chicago, the DePaul University, that got together and actually went through a detailed look at the idea of kindling and oxidative stress as contributors to myalgic encephalomyelitis and chronic fatigue. So that's who did this study. This is a great paper. It's fully available, downloading it online. So first of all, what are we talking about when it comes to kindling theory? Now, obviously, we're actually talking about limbic kindling. So what we're talking about is going on in the brain. And this is taken verbatim from the paper. According to the kindling theory, repeated exposure to an initially sub-threshold stimulus can eventually exceed threshold limits, resulting in persistent hypersensitivity to the stimulus and ultimately spontaneous behavioral manifestations, which means that an external stressor programs the brain to respond in a stress response. In a way, the brain becomes programmed, and then you don't even need the stress anymore. The brain is now programmed for chronic stress at the slightest provocation. Kindling was first discovered by Goddard in 1967 while studying the effects of electrical stimulation of the amygdaloid complex on learning. Initially, he electrically stimulated brains of rats at very low intensity, which was below the threshold for eliciting seizure activity. When this stimulation was applied over a period of weeks, the rats experienced epileptic convulsions. In other words, after repeated exposure to small electric shocks, the rats began to have spontaneous seizure-like electrical events. Goddard and others also found it was possible to induce kindling by chemical stimulation. So here we have electrical and chemical. That's already two of our bodies. So at the physical level, what can kindle a brain is at either chemicals like pesticides or at the electromagnetic level. So you could have a constant exposure to Wi-Fi can actually kindle the brain. Kindling was applied, is a theory behind epilepsy. It's also being applied now to chronic fatigue. It's also being thought of as a model for multiple chemical sensitivity. Gellhorn, going on about kindling theory, 1970, postulated that under prolonged stimulation of the limbic hypothalamic pituitary axis, a lowered threshold for activation can occur. Once this system is charged, either by high-intensity stimulation due to an acute viral infection, or by chronically repeated low-intensity stimulation through repeated chemical exposure, it can sustain a high level of arousal with little or no external stimulus. This is how adverse childhood events work as well. So you have either one-off shock or trauma, or low-level chronic stimulation, which could be viral, chemical, electrical, or psychological. It kindles the brain to cause a lower threshold so that any stressor is going to provoke a response and stimulate the entire HPA axis. So the body's in a chronic state of stress, which is very much what chronic fatigue syndrome is all about. These three researchers in 1990 suggested that excessive arousal can lead to an increase in the dendrites of the limbic system, which can further increase limbic stimulation. Wow, we're talking about being hardwired for stress. This is really what's happening in so many chronic complex illnesses. But chronic fatigue, probably fibromyalgia, chemical sensitivity, may be the poster children for this kind of this chronic stress response. So they're being stimulated. The brain is actually learning to chronically respond in that way. So now you just think about, we're actually saying some of the origination and the perpetuation of an illness like chronic fatigue is stress, and it's programmed in the brain. So you could do as much detoxification on the biological level as you like, but if you don't reprogram the brain, the person's still going to be ill. This is what I found where I worked in the clinic for 10 years, where we had a psychology division and a nutrition division. So here we have, here's the paper showing, this is the same, Dr. Len Jason came back and said, he originally said chemical, psychological, or electrical, biological could cause kindling. Here he confirms that an infectious illness might cause kindling of the limbic hypothalamic pituitary axis. Here is the great work of Ashok Gupta, who works on the psychology side with chronic fatigue. It was in the medical hypotheses. It's an overlapping paper. So he says during a traumatic neurological event, often involving acute psychological stress, combined with a viral infection or other chemical or physiological stressor, a conditioned network or cell assembly may be created in the amygdala, which is in the limbic system. And cell assembly means building neurons that are going down the stress pathway. So the brain is being programmed for stress. And this has been confirmed by other papers. So PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, they found increased amygdala activation, which confirms what Ashok was saying. So here this was a systemic review. Replicated localized functional changes include increased activation of the amygdala after symptom provocation. So in PTSD patients, what's happening is their amygdala has been programmed and is hypersensitive. And when they did a provocation, there's excessive activation of the amygdala compared to controls. This was the British Journal of Psychiatry for people with PTSD. Adverse childhood experiences are a massive factor in chronic fatigue. This would be back up this idea that kindling is going on in chronic fatigue syndrome, and psychology is one factor causing that. This is showing that these researchers originally started with 43 cases of CFS compared to controls. They found a 3 to 8-fold increased risk of chronic fatigue if you had childhood trauma. They repeated the study in 2009, the original one was 2006, doubled the size of the study. Exposure to childhood trauma was associated with a 6-fold increased risk of chronic fatigue. So this is just proof that, you know, it can be, I've mentioned infectious, it can be psychological. Mercury and toxins, there's actually quite a few papers out there showing that here's a group of 465 patients, had chronic mercury toxicity, 32% had severe fatigue. Removal of amalgam mercury fillings when combined with appropriate treatment resulted in significant symptom reduction. So what could be kindling somebody's brain? You know, do they have fillings? What's their psychological history? Exposure to viruses, this kind of thing. So it can be a range of different things. This is the paper looking at limbic kindling as a potential model for multiple chemical sensitivities. This is very interesting. You know, it could be with chemical sensitivity that maybe it's actual chemicals that the patient's been exposed to, which is causing inflammation in the brain and kindling with a propensity. The other thing that's very interesting is that emotional trauma will kindle the brain, and then it could be cross-sensitizing people to the chemical. Now, the other thing that's interesting about chemicals is that it could be the sense of smell which is triggering the reaction, because smell is processed by the olfactory system, which is in the limbic system. This is unlike things like sight and sound. That's processed by the thalamus. That's not part of the limbic system. The limbic system is the emotional brain, and it just so happens that smell affects emotion. So we have seen, there are case studies in the literature showing people who go through an emotional trauma and suddenly get chemical sensitivity. Now, isn't this interesting? So we're saying there's a brain causal factor for multiple chemical sensitivity. So there had to be an exposure maybe as well, but we're not saying about, it's not all coming from liver or gut necessarily. Brain programming could be coming into this. And by the way, just as a bit of background, you know, how humans learn anything is something called Hebbian theory. That means that cells that fire together wire together. So this is how, you know, how humans learn, is by this chronic stimulation, like electrical, chemical, and then that chronic stimulation actually causes the brain to learn in response. So Eric Kandel was a neuroscientist that won the Nobel Prize in 2000 for his, you know, in search of memory, and he basically proved Hebbian theory. So he repeatedly electrically stimulated he repeated electrical stimulation sensitized nerves, causing them to learn. So he actually, what he did is he worked on sea slugs, and he electrically stimulated them and caused them to learn to react in a certain way. This is the same as the Pavlov's dogs experiments, where you ring the bell, give them food, ring the bell, give them food. In the end, you can ring the bell and they start salivating even though no food is given. So it's conditioning. This is how humans learn. It's how memory, it's how children learn to walk, it's how we learn vocabulary. So it's just the same as, you know, this is not a weird theory. This is basically basic neuroscience on learning. What's the proof of limbic kindling in chronic fatigue? Well, very interesting papers that have come out recently. This is the first paper by Japanese researchers that confirmed neuroinflammation in patients with chronic fatigue syndrome. It's present in widespread brain areas in CFS-ME patients and was associated with the severity of neuropsychological symptoms. Evaluation of neuroinflammation in CFS-ME patients may be essential for understanding the core pathophysiology and for developing objective diagnostic criteria and effective medical treatments. Brain inflammation in CFS, here they found reduced ganglia activation in subjects. That happens when you have neuroinflammation, another paper that confirmed it. You would expect with this inflammation and chronic stress for an increase in free radical levels. Here they were looking at a number of factors including glutathione and confirmed that patients with chronic fatigue have increased oxidative stress and therefore may play a role in the etiopathophysiciology. So let's talk about this limbic disorder. Just a brief summary of the limbic system. It's the emotional center of the brain. It's actually part of the forebrain. It's not the oldest part of the brain. It's the sort of second oldest. So the brainstem is like the reptilian part. It's still part of the primitive defense mechanism. So it's where we process where we process fight, flight, fight. So am I in danger? And it's like the hippocampus processes and stores information, memory, survival, protective reflexes, and it remembers trauma. It's the amygdala that processes survival-related info and encodes emotional memory, the brain's fear center. It responds to immediate things in our environment, and it's unconscious. And this speaks to then those three. The singular gyrus, by the way, is actually like the gate at the beginning. So it acts as a guard at the gate about whether to alert the amygdala to impending dangers, focuses attention on threatening stimuli. The hippocampus that has a memory role with the amygdala processes it and says to the hypothalamus, hey, hypothalamus, you need to deal with the fact we're under stress. The hypothalamus is in charge of the chemistry, and it speaks to then the adrenal glands via the pituitary, giving this endocrine response. So this is the classic limbic hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis response. And what we're saying really is that when you have kindling, you have an overactivation of the limbic system. It leads to chronic sympathetic stress, which obviously works through this HPA axis, leading to chronic output of cortisol, which eventually becomes a very pro-inflammatory situation. It's really where the rubber hits the road in mind-body medicine. The other thing that the limbic system will do is talk directly to the nervous system for release of epinephrine or adrenaline. So there's like a double response. So there's a sympathetic stress response, which is through the epinephrine and norepinephrine, and then it speaks to the endocrine system via what we call the HPA axis. So the consequences, they go through the consequences of this limbic kindling in CFS-ME in the paper. And this is where all of this is. If you want to know more about the papers behind, that are sort of like a summary review of all the things that have been found in the medical literature that go wrong in chronic fatigue, this paper is a great summary paper. It goes through and it shows you the papers that it would cause glandular depletion. So this is what they say is the result of limbic kindling and chronic HPA axis stimulation. Glandular depletion, they mean reduced adrenal gland size, and output of cortisol is eventually lowered. That's called, more commonly known as adrenal fatigue. What would limbic kindling cause? A Th1-Th2 imbalance. So Th2 sensitivity means more reactions to chemicals and all the rest of it, reactions to food, but a reduced Th1 defenses, which means more bugs, more viruses, more bacteria, candida and so on, our defenses are lower. Disruption in the ion transport channel, that's what's going in and out of cell membranes, so that's not good. We have cellular disruption going on. Reduced grey matter in the brain and lesions. These are all papers that have been found to show that in chronic fatigue patients. This would explain reduction of GABA, which is the calming neurotransmitter, and increase things like NDA, which is a pro-excitatory, pro-inflammatory neurotransmitter. It would also lead to overall reduction of antioxidants. It would lead to cardiomyopathy, left ventricular dysfunction, which has been found in chronic fatigue, oxidative stress, and mitochondrial dysfunction. And I mentioned in my last webinar, mitochondrial dysfunction is huge. This is the cardinal symptom of chronic fatigue, which is post-exertional fatigue. is probably described by mitochondrial dysfunction. It probably is the mechanism, because ATP provides the energy for the cell. It's made in the mitochondria by oxidative phosphorylation, which means it's taking ADP, that's adenosine diphosphate, that's 2 phosphates. In the mitochondria, ADP is converted to ATP, so they shove on a phosphate to make it adenosine triphosphate, so we now have 3 phosphates, and then it gets recycled, and as that ATP moves down to ADP, that's your release of energy for the body to do its digestion, to run, to think, to do all that. So this is cycling that's going on, ATP, in the mitochondria, that gets disrupted. It should, I think they were saying it's about 10 cycles a second, and if that gets blocked or disrupted, you're going to have slow recycling, and that's post-exertional fatigue. That is the biological basis for poor stamina. So what's actually happening, this is the brilliant work of Dr. Sarah Myhill. Definitely recommend looking into her work. She's done some of the most work on looking at mitochondrial dysfunction. Dr. Sarah Myhill is an expert in the UK on chronic fatigue syndrome. If this is what's actually going on with the aerobic production of energy in the mitochondria, remember in the cytoplasm it's anaerobic. The aerobic part is where you get much more energy production, goes on in the mitochondria through oxidative phosphorylation. We have this part called the electron transfer chain. For that to work well, you've got to have good cooling enzymes, because there's some nasty stuff produced by the electron transfer chain, free radicals, superoxides, nitric oxides. They make nasty things like peroxynitrate, hydrogen peroxide, and hydroxyl radicals. Sad face, because those are bad news for the body if they are out of control and not. And so it's just like a car engine, it needs to be kept cool. What keeps the car engine cool are enzymes like catalase, glutathione, peroxidase, superoxide dismutase. And as we just said, it's the antioxidants that are getting depleted in chronic fatigue. Therefore, the electron transfer chain gets out of control. We have a free radical stress response in response to doing exercise. That causes inflammation and a whole set of changes at the cellular level, which are very unhealthy and bad for the body. So essentially the body shuts down mitochondrial function because it's self-protection. Wow, every time I do exercise, I damage the body. So I'm going to shut down my mitochondria. Self-protection. That really describes what's going on with chronic fatigue syndrome. The one thing they didn't say in the paper, that Dr. Leonard Jason didn't say in the paper, and it was a huge area that they missed out, and I actually said to Dr. Leonard Jason, you've missed out talking about the impact of limbic kindling that causes leaky gut and gut dysbiosis. So we know that stress causes intestinal damage. It also causes, colonic barrier dysfunction. There are tons of papers showing that stress, it could be caused by electrical, chemical, any of those stressors causes leaky gut. That's confirmed in the literature. Limbic kindling would also reduce the lymph flow and slow down detoxification. There's a whole treatment in the UK called the Perrin technique, which is a form of deep lymphatic drainage, and it's the 3rd most popular treatment in the UK, in front of everything except pacing and relaxation. So it's more popular than psychology interventions and all biochemistry interventions, and it's literally a form of helping the lymph move. And this is Dr. Raymond Perrin's paper that's published. He's an osteopath, saying he thinks that this chronic stress affects breathing, and those two things affect how the lymph flows. So the blood system has a heart that pumps the blood system. The lymph relies, we all thought it relied on kind of activity and movement. It's also breathing and the sympathetic part of the nervous system. And he's saying basically that chronic stress causes lymph stasis. So now people are getting toxic as well. This is bad news for sleep. We know that chronic fatigue and sleep is it's a cardinal symptom. People with chronic fatigue syndrome don't sleep. That's really bad news. Here was a major paper that came out in 2013 in Science, that major journal. This kind of hit the complementary and conventional medicine world. Very big deal that sleep drives metabolite clearance from the adult brain. So the brain has a lymphatic system that clears out at night when you sleep. And if you can't sleep, you don't clear out. So what would cause sleep disruption? Kindling, limbic kindling causes sleep disruption, means the brain's not detoxifying. So this So this is really just summarising limbic kindling. This is the mind-body model. It's the best that we have there to explain how all these factors, including psychology, change the brain, changes the body. And by the way, all those changes that happen in the body as a result of limbic kindling would have an upwards impact as well, and would actually induce more limbic kindling. So it's a feedback mechanism as well. But like I said, what's happening at the sort of the brain level is also going to be directly sort of same thing is going to be happening at the cellular level. And this is, I would really recommend looking at this second paper, which is the cell danger response, metabolic features of the cell danger response. So the amazing thing is the way our brains are responding to stressors at the cellular level. The cell is its own little organism that is, you know, responding the same way our brain does. So, you know, stressors are also registered at the cellular level. Now, this is a really important paper. It's at the forefront of research in chronic fatigue. It's by Robert Naveau. They call Robert Naveau Dr. Mr. Mitochondria. He's the president of the Mitochondrial Medicine Association, and world-leading expert on mitochondria and cell biochemistry. And he is looking at building a biomarker for chronic fatigue. So this is the first, he's working with labs to create the first blood level sort of biomarker to diagnose chronic fatigue syndrome by looking at what's coming out at the cellular level and signs of changes at the cellular level which prove that a kind of chronic fatigue syndrome exists and there's a pattern to it. So he's put this theory together. It's called the cell danger response. And what that is it's the evolutionarily conserved metabolic response that protects cells and hosts from harm. It's triggered by encounters with chemical, physical, or biological threats that exceeds the cellular capacity for homeostasis. So just like the brain, if it has this chronic or high-level exposure to a stressor, it has to respond, and that's exactly what's happening at the cellular level. The resulting metabolic mismatch between available resources and functional capacity produces a cascade of changes at the cellular level. So this is what's happening in chronic fatigue. We've talked about the high-level brain-body system, and now we're looking at cellular in a bit more detail. So in the face of stress, what he's saying is that there are 8 responses, what are called cell danger responses. Now this is the way that's a good analogy to understand this. Consider London during the Blitz. So when the Germans were bombing London, the whole of London undertook, if you like, a cell danger response. You know, they built bunkers, there was food rationing, you would sleep in certain places, there were people sleeping in the tube at night, so there was a response to these dangers, and there was a great deal of disruption to normal functioning life, obviously, but it was a response, it was a protection mechanism, and that's what happens in the cells. So there's some of the things that happen is that this shift from cellular metabolism from polymer to monomer synthesis. That means ATP and ADP are no longer produced. The tri and the di goes to monophosphates, which bad news, we have no ATP being produced because the cells say, wow, we've got to bunker up here, we're under attack. Things like stiffening the cell membranes, building the walls of protection. Bad news because we can't get things in and out of the cell. Obviously, we're going to do things like release antiviral and antimicrobial chemicals if it's a sort of viral attack. Here's bad news, autophagy, mitochondrial fission and mitophagy. This is a bit like, you know, we'll kill our own resources before the bugs can get them and use our resources to strengthen themselves. So this is triggering apoptosis, you know, kind of cell death, autophagy. So we're actually remetabolizing nutrients in the cell in response to getting rid of these intracellular pathogens. And there's other things that happen. DNA methylation is changed, mobilization of endogenous retroviruses, things to help fight off the stress. So this is fine. That's how cells respond. It's called the cell danger response, and you can have a look at this paper in a bit more detail. In a response to that, we have a lot of danger signals that are sent out, ATP, ADP, cells that send out signaling to the rest of the body to say, hey, we're under stress and attack. But what's supposed to happen is after the danger has been eliminated or neutralized, a choreographed sequence of anti-inflammatory and regenerative pathways is activated to reverse the cell danger response and to heal. That's what's supposed to happen. If it persists, if this cell danger response persists abnormally, the whole body metabolism and the gut microbiome are disturbed. So the collective performance of multiple organ systems is impaired, behaviors change, chronic disease results. Bad news. Metabolic memory of past stress encounters is stored in the form of altered mitochondrial and cellular macromolecule content, resulting in increased functional reserve capacity through a process known as mitocellular hormesis. So really what we're saying is that the cellular memory, it can get chronically stored in the cell, just like kindling will train the neurons of the brain, and this is what's going on at the cellular level as well. Now this is really interesting. It's meant to be under control. This whole cell danger response is under control of the brain stem, which is the oldest part of the brain. So interestingly, the brain stem is actually controlled by the hypothalamus. There's some interaction there. So psychological stress and limbic kindling could cause a cellular danger response as well. So here we have everything affects everything. What could be causing cell danger? What are the factors which cause it? It can be chemical, physical, or microbial, just like limbic kindling. Common microbial effects are viruses, bacteria, fungi, and parasites. At the chemical level, it's heavy metals, trace metals, mercury, cadmium, arsenic, nickel, certain electrophilic aromatic chemicals like plasticizer, bisphenol A that's in plastic bottles, flame retardants that's in all our furniture and car furniture, like brominated diphenyl ethers, pesticides, DDT, and so on. So physical shocks, meaning governed by physics rather than biochemistry, heat, salt, pH shock, UV, or ionizing radiation. And here, Robert Naveau confirms psychological trauma, particularly during childhood, can also activate the cell danger response, produce chronic inflammation, and increase the risk of many disorders. So a chronic activation of the CDR, cell danger response, alters both the physical habitat of the distal bowel and the availability of resources in the form of dietary nutrients. So it causes gut dysbiosis. So cellular danger response would cause gut dysbiosis. This is really important, and this is why I'm leading everything to the gut, because there's so many papers and focus on gut dysbiosis in chronic fatigue. And yes, the papers are there. You know, gut inflammation is a feature of chronic fatigue syndrome. This paper shows all the factors running up to, all the papers running up to 2010 on gut inflammation are in this paper, which is a very useful paper, confirming and kind of analysing and talking about them. Essentially, there's plenty of papers out there. Here's another one that's actually part of Demelier that I mentioned, Kenny Demelier work, where he's shown that there are alterations of intestinal microbiota in ME chronic fatigue. So, you know, gut dysbiosis is a feature in chronic fatigue syndrome, same as limbic kindling is. Now, we know that leaky gut causes autoimmunity. This is the great Fasano paper, major journal, Mechanisms of Disease, the role of intestinal barrier function in the pathogenesis of gastrointestinal autoimmune diseases. This is an important paper. So if you've got leaky gut, you have a massive increased risk of autoimmunity. Question, are there autoimmune processes going on in chronic fatigue? It would appear so. So this is a very, it's the other major area of research, ongoing research in chronic fatigue, where there's a lot of excitement about it. So this is where, by mistake, a group of oncologists, I think based in Northern Europe, they were either, I think they were Norwegian or Swedish, where they were working with a patient who had a form of white blood cell cancer, and they treated her cancer with something called rituximab, which kills B lymphocytes. So, and as they did that, it cured her cancer, but she also had chronic fatigue and ME. She happened to have that too, and it totally cured the chronic fatigue syndrome. So here this is a phase 2 trial looking at 29 patients. I believe this would have been phase 2 study, where basically as a result of this rituximab knocking out B lymphocytes, which were usually the things that are in arthritis that are attacking cells, that's autoimmunity, by knocking out the B lymphocytes, 64% of patients had a massive improvement. So there must be some form of autoimmune process going on. This could be linked to leaky gut. What's causing leaky gut? All of those other things which are causing limbic kindling and the cell danger response, all leading to leaky gut. So now here's the key thing. This is the point of why I've talked about these two papers. You know, there's so much focus on the gut, and all we need to do is heal the gut. I'm sorry, that's not enough. We can't just heal the gut. Healing the gut in a localized manner, we're not even dealing with the root causes of how the gut became imbalanced. You know, the gut is just a part of the picture. Here's Dr. Robert Naveau talking about the gut. Halfway through there, he says, look, CDR causes, that's, you know, the cell danger response causes gut dysbiosis. But here we go. Restoring a sick microbiome is not as simple as adding back missing or underrepresented species. Both the physical habitat of the gut and the nutrient resources delivered must be durably changed in order to produce a durable change in the complex microbial ecosystem. So if we look at this, we have basically a chronic cycle of stress and fatigue. So we can have, basically, it'll either be, we can't just localize things and just think about the gut. So a chemical, electrical, psychological, or microbial stressor causes limbic kindling and a chronic cell danger response that becomes stuck in that way. It's maladaptive. This leads to what? More chemical, electrical, psychological, and microbial stress. And here we have the vicious cycle of stress. So, you know, sorting out the gut's important. Working on balancing the guts and healing the gut lining is important, but it's one tiny part of this overall picture. So I don't want to throw gut work out. It's just, we've gone crazy about the gut, and it's just, we should be talking as much about brain-body interactions and what's happening at a cellular level as we are about gut health, and it's just kind of a bit crazy. But anyway, implications. So the implications of all of this is that we need to start with probably cleaning up the environment of these factors that are the cellular psychology, the psychology, electrical, chemical sort of factors in the environment. So one of the things, this is the last bit from this Robert Naveau paper, he says an important caveat. He's, by the way, coming up with a treatment where he's using a drug to stop the cell danger response signaling. So it's a very kind of reductionistic approach again, but he's blocking the cell signaling from the cell danger response. That's his kind of drug therapy he's looking at producing. And that would stop this cell danger response from happening and sort of cut it off. Now, it's kind of a very reductionistic way of working, again, because he's a conventional trained medical doctor. It's the same as rituximab, kind of very reductionistic. So people could end up being on the drug, which blocks the chemical pathway, but never deals with the ultimate underlying causes. But here, Dr. Robert Naveau actually says, an important caveat to APT, that's correcting this maladaptive CDR with this sort of drug that he's designing, is that if the physical, chemical, or biological trigger of the CDR has not been eliminated or neutralized from the environment of the patient, treatments designed to inhibit the persistent cell danger response may have mixed effect. For example, if the CDR is a response to perinatal exposure to flame retardants, but the flame retardants haven't been removed from the living space of an affected child, then you can't switch off the cell danger response very effectively. In fact, it may do more harm. Under these conditions, may cause net harm. This is like all the Londoners during the time of the Blitz being in their bunkers at night, protecting themselves, and then someone coming along saying, hey, let's normalize life, let's normalize function, come out, stop being in your bunkers, let's stop rationing food, rationing foods. But the bombs are still coming, so nobody stopped the bombs. So you send everybody out, and they all get killed by the bombs. You've got to stop the bombing. Don't come out until the bombs are, So that means the bombs are these triggers, these stresses like chemical, biological, and so on. So when we clean up, there's obviously things we could do to correct at the biochemical body. There's things we can do to correct things at the energetic level and the psychospiritual. All I'm going to touch on today are the step one with your patients would be to clean up things that are ongoing in the environment. Now, you could do testing to find out what specific things are affecting the person, and we'll talk about that in a second towards the end. But generally the way that I start is, just from an optimum health perspective, if somebody hasn't got money to spend on doing loads of testing, I just say, look, if someone comes to me with chronic fatigue, I'm like, do a home chemical, electromagnetic, and relationship cleanup and start there, because this is preventative for all chronic complex illnesses. So, you want to optimize the environment. So this is an argument to say that you could clean up, just do a cleanup, and this is stuff that everybody could do. So you can get more personalised, and we'll talk about that. But I'm just going to go through some. I've got 3 handouts for you. All the sort of environmental factors that you might want to consider at the physical, energetic, and psycho-spiritual level. And you can take these handouts, you can convert them into handouts to your patients, you can do your own branding on them, but these are just sort of all the factors. So obviously, you know, physical environmental causes are major. We're living in a very polluted world today. Here was a study of, this is the study most people kind of quote, done by the Environmental Working Group, where they had 5 labs in the US, Canada, and Europe, analysed umbilical cord blood, and they found 232 industrial compounds and pollutants in these babies, which just shows you what a toxic world we're living in. So this is the homework chemical cleanup. You know, here this handout includes papers, all the papers linked to what happens with people who are exposed to mercury, all the heavy metals, and also what the sources are. So I just send this out as like, yeah, I've got it on my website, and I just have it as like, if you want to be in a clean environment, these are the factors you may want to consider. So there's lead, cadmium, arsenic, nickel is a huge one in chronic fatigue. Major papers are linking nickel toxicity, nickel sensitivity in chronic fatigue patients, nickel allergy in chronic fatigue. Have a look at that paper. It's a linked paper there. Very important. Aluminium is increasingly exposed. Aflatoxins is mold. There's a range of different things that we are exposed to from industrial output, often in things that like our own furniture and things like this. Bisphenol A is now a huge one. It's a hormone disruptor, and it's in plastic bottles. It's on paper receipts that come from the checkouts of shops. Really bad news. I'm afraid there's plasticizers, plastics, so you can have a look through this, and you can click on these and see all the related papers. Nitrosamines, overcooked foods, it's the black in the protein. Obviously pesticides added to foods. Hair dye, it's another major one. So here, these are the areas you want to be considering. Have a look at the handout. You want to be looking at food, ways to clean up water, ways to clean up air, ways to look at your hygiene products, and also home cleaning products. So this is kind of, I got everyone to just do this as a step 1, but you can personalize it afterwards by testing and saying which are the ones that are specific to your patients. This is the electromagnetic cleanup. That's another handout. Here's the Bioinitiative 2012. This is by a group of major scientists and researchers. They brought together 2,000 papers showing all the negative biological impact of Wi-Fi and cell phones and so forth. Here's the handout. Hopefully you'll find this useful. So here the links here. Here's 2,300 studies done by naval research up to 1971. Click on that, have a look. Thousands of studies from 1981 to present by UK Power Watch. 1,900 papers from the Bioinitiative report, and there's another link there to another 6,000 studies. And we're looking at the effects of cell phones, cell phone masks, Wi-Fi, cordless phones, smart meters, power lines, and microwaves. And this is the papers that they're all linked to, what it does. Interfering with cell membranes, calcium channels. This was one theory behind why there is ion transport issues showing in chronic fatigue syndrome. So could EMFs be affecting cell membranes in chronic fatigue syndrome, for example? And I'll leave you to go through all that because it's quite a lot. But also what to do about this blue light exposure and major impact on circadian rhythms. Blue light should only be exposed during the day. When blue light is getting through the retina at night at the wrong time of day, because we're all looking at computer screens and so on, it's signaling to the brain that it's daylight, and it will wake you up, and it will disturb sleep. That's originally, it's Harvard researchers doing that work. There's all the links. Exposure at night disrupts sleep and circadian rhythms. This is original research by Harvard, so medical school. So have a look through some of that. Here's some of the comprehensive recommendations that you'd want to give people to clean up, you know, the Wi-Fi. Switch the Wi-Fi off at night. You know, don't have your phone on at night. Switch it off. There's loads of recommendations in there. What to do about blue light, how to protect yourself as well, and how to protect your patients. So that covers the energy level. What about the psycho-spiritual level of causes? So this is often a missed level, but environmental causes coming from relationship and the psychology level are so huge. It's probably bigger than the chemical and electromagnetic environment. Here's a meta study, okay, published. This was a landmark study. It was so big. 309,000 participants were reviewed. This came out in 2010. Okay, social support was a greater predictor of survival than physical activity, body mass index, hypertension, air pollution, alcohol consumption, and even smoking 15 cigarettes a day. So, you know, the quality of the relationships of people around you is either enlivening you or killing you, quite literally. You know, psychological environmental causes. There's so many papers on this now. You know, here's a paper from the BMJ, the British Medical Journal, in 2008. A friend who lives within a mile and becomes happy increases the probability that the person is happy by 25%. So if all your friends are happy, you're 25% more likely to be happy yourself. People's happiness depends on the happiness of others with whom they are connected. This provides further justification for seeing happiness, like health, as a collective phenomenon. Humans don't exist in a vacuum. If you are living with somebody or have a work environment where you are being exposed to abuse, physical, mental, or emotional abuse, that level of abuse is going into your body, it's being registered by the brain, and it's causing a cell danger response and limbic kindling, okay? If you have traumatic people in your life, whether they're abusers, I'm afraid that victims of abuse can also be just as draining. I call them energy vampires, and I know that it's a provocative term purposefully, because we really need to wake up about what's happening on the relationship level. Kind of looks like it's even more important than energetic and chemical factors. Here's a New England Journal of Medicine looking at obesity. A person's chances of becoming obese increased by 57% if he or she had a friend who became obese in a given interval. So, in other words, you know, who you are who you hang out with. It used to be the stage you are what you eat. You are also who you hang out with. So you are more likely to have to bring on their illnesses if they have illnesses. You're more likely to, if somebody is abusive. This in clinical practice, I found the number one factor that would prevent somebody from overcoming chronic fatigue completely would be, it would usually be, unfortunately, be a family member that was very troublesome and that they were looking after or felt duty-bound to do it. And we had to say to them, you're unlikely to recover if you can't get away from this toxic stressor. And you know, it's a difficult area. It can be a tricky area. It has to be handled with a lot of empathy and care. And people need a lot of support and training on how to communicate boundaries and deal with psychological aspects and relationships. You know, here's a paper, you know, if you have a non-empathic practitioner, that's, you know, if you're a patient with a non-empathic practitioner, it shows that when, for example, when patients perceive clinicians as empathic, rating them perfect on the care tool, the severity, duration, and objective measures of interleukin-8 and neutrophils of the common cold significantly change. In other words, if you have an empathic practitioner, it's anti-inflammatory. Okay? If you have a very cold practitioner who doesn't believe that you're ill, that's been a common occurrence in chronic fatigue, that has made that patient will actually go away iller as a result. Very important. This is really important work as well. Last pointer about relationships. Sorry, just skipped aside there. But the trauma of chronic complex illness. You know, if you get a chronic disease, that is traumatic. It's a traumatic experience, and this is the brilliant work of Patricia Fennell, and she has her 4-phase model, which is essentially just saying the emotional trauma has 4 phases to it. It's a well-established thing, if you like, within the psychology world. And this is, again, it's being downplayed and not well understood in complementary medicine either. That you know, trauma is pro-inflammatory, and so things like where chronic fatigue syndrome patients were told that they were just making it up. They were told that they were not really ill, and because there was no biological marker for it, it must be a psychiatric illness, and is probably deviant, what they call deviant psychiatric behaviour, which means attention seeking. When someone who has got a serious illness is being treated like that by society, in other words, there was a cultural stigma, mass consciousness had a cultural stigma attached to chronic fatigue syndrome, that was making people biologically sicker. And she goes into this in the chapter in the Chronic Fatigue Syndrome book here, which was edited by Dr. Leonard Jason. She was a major contributor to that book. And she also talked about the same problem with HIV patients who were dying faster and earlier when there was a nasty cultural stigma, and these people were being stigmatized and isolated. So just you know, think about your environment. So think about your patient's relationship environment. This, just by the way, the science of psychoneuroimmunology confirms one of the most robust findings is a strong correlation between healthy, close personal relationships and immune function. So it's not only what's going on in your own brain, it's those around you. So I've got a whole handout, kind of quite a provocative handout, on how and why to complete a relationship and cultural cleanup. Who are you hanging out with all the time? Who's your patients? Are they supportive in the family? Are they having to take care of people when they're actually very sick? Are they with support groups that are very negative or don't believe people can recover from the illness? Are they hanging around with conventional people who think the illness isn't real? That's very damaging. And also, you know, if it's not just abuse, are they with abusive, verbally, emotionally, mentally abusive people? That's a major perpetuator of chronic complex illness. Also, unfortunately, as I mentioned, victims can be very draining too, energy drainers. Now, it's a tricky area to deal with because we all want to be loving, caring, helping people. But unfortunately, it's the people who are chronically stuck in victimhood who will constantly drain your energy. You know, you can't recover if you're already depleted yourself with chronic fatigue, and you've got somebody who's a chronically emotionally traumatized person who's not helping themselves, who's just stuck there and just wants to feed off your energy, which is really what's happening. You can't recover. So it's a huge area, very important. So you've got the handout there. I encourage you to have a read about the relationships and cultural cleanup if you didn't realise that how important that area is. So essentially, I'm now just going to talk about, this is coming to the end of the CEU CPD section of this talk.